With me tonight is stormwater engineer Dan O'Brien, and he's going to help move this along and answer any questions if we have them. We are providing you a status report on the Boulevard Park flooding situation, and I'll start by giving you a quick overview of the problem as we have previously presented. So to start with, let's see if we can advance it. Okay. Here's a map of the drainage basin that we've been studying. It extends from South 120th Street to the north, 12th Avenue south to the west, and then Des Moines Memorial Drive on the east, and 136th Street to the south. And the water course runs, shown on the map is a historical natural drainage course that runs primarily through private property. It is a historic non-fish bearing stream. The only parts of it that are currently city owned and operated are the road crossings and directly adjacent to the road crossings at 124th and at 14th and 128th. As you may recall, the last time we presented, the primary cause of flooding in the north end of the basin is unpermitted filling of the channel and a replacement of a pipe just south of what's known as location 3 on this map. And I think Dan's trying to point to it for me. The new privately installed pipe is an 8-inch pipe. It used to be a 12-inch pipe. It's receiving stormwater from the city's 24-inch culvert. The channel through that area was filled in and the pipe was placed too high in the system to allow the area to the north of there to properly drain. And then as you continue south throughout the basin, there are private property modifications to the channel that have occurred over decades. While the channel was a historic stream, many property owners have controlled it by installing various channels and pipes that constrict and meter the flow throughout the entire thing. As you may recall, we also sent letters to all of the property owners and the residents whose properties touch that corridor. That's approximately 75 different properties. And we met with and received comments from about a half dozen. And the descriptions they provided are consistent with what our modeling shows. So we modeled the entire area for the drainage. And the comments received were quite consistent with what the model showed. So on the next slide, and again, most of these slides you've seen before, this describes what we saw in the model and also what was reflected in the comments received, which is in that entire corridor, a total of 12 properties reported flooding, and all 12 of those had flooding of their yards or property behind their building. 8 properties, 8 of the 12 also had flooding in outbuildings or crawl spaces or sheds, things of that nature. And then 2 of those properties had flooding inside the living space of their home. So along the entire corridor, we only have heard from 2 people who had flooding in their home. The cause of the flooding, as I mentioned before, private property owners modifying the historic stream channel over time. And groundwater. Groundwater is another thing we don't know as much about, but the northernmost home on the map has a septic design that included a French drain to cut off water coming from the north. And those are the words from the design of that septic system. It said French drain to cut off water coming from the north. This is concerning because it means that back at the time that septic system was designed, which in this case was 1958, the groundwater was so high that the designer was trying to manipulate it from getting into the septic system by carrying it around the drain field. So this means regardless of what the city does with the surface water, the property may still have a septic problem due to the high groundwater table. Okay. So this slide was the one we shared previously also that describes how the different types of projects can help with the different types of problems. So on the left, you see kind of the description of what we just talked about, yards that flood, outbuildings that flood, septic backups, flooding of the actual residents. And then across the top are alternative projects and some preliminary prices that, by the way, do not show the necessary right-of-way needs. So those are without right-of-way needs, and almost all of those projects would need some right-of-way to actually construct. And a significant one, of course, is the install sewer, which last time we met, we had not yet incorporated that into our ARPA plans, but now we have, and we also know that the sewer district is making significant progress in that regard. And you can see from the range of projects, you know, from existing no dollars to 12 million on the far right, that each one has some impact on the number of yards that flood and The colors are meant to help you understand the transition from as conditions improve across the board. The septic backups, those get resolved when sewer gets there and people hook up to sewer. What I don't know is if for say sewer wasn't to come, which it is going to come, but whether those would continue just be from the groundwater that I mentioned previously. So that's why you see those question marks there. Is without the sewer, I don't know if a stormwater project is going to solve the actual septic flooding. So then the next slide, walking through some of the considerations and risks that council has been discussing and probably will continue to talk about as we move forward. So a project here would obviously have a goal of reducing flooding on private property. And this is really difficult for the individual property owners to address. There's no solution that any one person can do on that one person's property to solve this problem. It requires the cooperation of multiple people along the corridor because you're trying to move stormwater through an entire area. Building a system there would support or could support future development. So we could accommodate additional impervious surfaces in the future. And water quality will improve with the sewer installation. So once we get rid of the septic systems and get people hooked up to sewer, we won't have the ongoing contamination issues associated with septic backups. But other thoughts to keep in mind is this is an issue that is caused by and located on private property. So the city is taking on liability if we do a project up there for a new stormwater system. So if we were to pick one of those alternatives that constructs something new through the private property, that would have to become a city system and we would take care of it. Flooding's not unique to this area. This is not the only place in the city that has not only wet backyards, which is as I showed on the shared on the previous slide, you know, the bulk of these are wet backyards, but also we have other homes that flood and basements, crawl spaces, those sorts of things that flood throughout the city. Condemnation authority would be necessary for this one because any solution we make through this corridor is going to be on those private properties because that's where the stormwater is going to flow if we were to build a system there. While some of the people will obviously jump at providing us those property rights, there will be some along the corridor who likely will not, and we would need that authority if we were going to be successful in the project to either get easements or property rights that would allow us to build the infrastructure and get the project done. And we obviously have not budgeted any funds for a project at this time, so funding is also something that's needed. So then again, popping back to this slide, as you can see in kind of the middle of the slide, there's $1 million and a $4.3 million project, which is probably with property rights closer to 5 million. Those are kind of starting to hit a place where you're making a difference in all of the categories here. So that's a range where between that 1 and 5 million, you would, I think, start to have an impact on these 12 yards that flood. As you go across this, know that those are the number of occurrences, shall we say, or properties that have these things. But also as you go across, they become less frequent and less severe. So when we say wet backyards, we're talking about anywhere from 0 to 6 inches. But as you progress across and you make some of these stormwater improvements, the depth is less, but also the frequency during that window of months is also less. So status where we're at. The council in last fall budgeted the $400,000 of the ARPA funds to go help with the sewer connection. So our next step on that is getting an agreement with the sewer district to distribute those to the people who are going to sign up for connections. At the time we presented that to you, we talked about 42 connections. I think it's still in that order. I have not checked in with the sewer district in the last few weeks, but that was still what it was about a month ago. So we'll be working on an agreement. That agreement will come before you to provide those funds to the sewer district. And that's going to reduce each homeowner's contribution for the connection fee for their site. The sewer district has been successful, as we've previously discussed, in getting some of their grants and are moving along nicely on their project. We can always consider doing additional options with regard to stormwater after sewer installation. That's something we've talked about in the past. We can see how sewer goes. So that's something to hold in the back of your mind. But the other thing is You recently sent a letter thanking Congresswoman Jayapal for a $5 million authorization that was received in the Water Resources Development Act. Just to be clear, though, that was an authorization, and the terminology gets a little confusing here, but we do have to get that appropriated before that money becomes available to us. And so I've talked with Mike Doubleday, our federal consultant, who's going to help us try to get that funding appropriated. And then if that funding were appropriated, I would come back and talk to you, bounce back to that other slide and talk to you about those options that were around that range of funding to discuss.